Hello and welcome to this bonus episode of the Prospect Podcast. My name is Benjamin Clark and I'm joined today by Saikat Chakrabarti. Saikat has worked for various politicians on the left flank of the US Democratic Party, including Senator Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and now he's running for Congress himself. He's running for a seat in San Francisco, which is currently occupied by Nancy Pelosi. So, Saikat, why are you running?
Well, the real reason I'm running is after watching Trump get elected again, right? I sort of saw the reaction from the Democratic Party. And, I call me naive because I've been in there. I worked in Congress. I was chief of staff to AOC. But I really thought after the second election, the Democrats would have some sort of a come to Jesus moment. They'd sort of look at the fact that they lost a big part of their working class base and have some sort of soul searching about what did we do wrong? What should we be doing? How should we plan for the next time? And also, what do we do to actually stop this kind of creeping rise of authoritarianism in the country? And I saw none of that. I even saw Nancy Pelosi. She went on this podcast over here and she was asked point blank, what did the Democrats do wrong? What should they change? And her answer was basically nothing. We did our best. We had decent results and we'll do better next time, right? That was kind of her answer. And I just feel like it's completely inadequate. And, my politics for a long time has been that we actually need to solve real problems in this country that are the underlying reason for why someone like Donald Trump is getting elected. And I just felt like now's the time to jump in the race and actually push that and try to get the movement going that will try to save this country from authoritarianism, right?
Yeah, interesting. So I guess to unpack that a little bit, Democrats at the moment, some polls have them at their lowest favorability ever as a party. What is your theory? You say that you're disappointed with, the approach that they've taken since the election, but why do you think they lost this election and why, what would you do differently? What's your sort of vision for the Democratic Party going forward or what are you annoyed at that they're, not facing up to at the moment?
Yeah. Yeah, it's not just about this election because we got to step back a little bit. At the end of the day, for the last 40 or 50 years, life has just been gradually getting worse and worse for a big majority of Americans, right? Like wages have been stagnant for the bottom, 60 to 70% of people here. And at the same time, the cost of essentials, housing, healthcare, childcare, education, this stuff has just been skyrocketing. And what it's really done is it's shown people, are really realizing that the current status quo we have is just completely broken. So anytime anybody runs on this vision for bold, sweeping economic change, I think they win. I think that's what people thought they're voting for with Barack Obama. That's what people thought they're voting for with Donald Trump in 2016. Even with Joe Biden in 2020, that was kind of a reaction to Trump. And then now there's going to be a reaction to, the reaction to Biden was Trump again in 2024. And ultimately, I think what the Democrats are not doing, there's two reasons I'd say why they're really polling so poorly right now. One is they're just not believable as wanting to take on the system and pitch anything that's actually going to change the system itself, not just these slow iterative changes that are not going anywhere. Because people are open to the kind of change. They just know the thing has got to change, right? Like what we've got right now, it's not working. But on top of that, I think Democrats are just seen as sluggish and incompetent and not fighters. And, they're not, you can't trust them to actually execute whatever you are putting, whatever solution they do put out on the table. And I think that's what we're seeing in the results. People right now really hate Donald Trump. He's also polling pretty poorly, but the Democratic Party is actually polling worse than him, right? So I think the way this changes, it'll only work. It's not just ideas. We do need like a real plan and a vision for reversing this long-term decline that's been happening. But we need completely new people in the party who are actually competent and will fight and will get the job done, right? And that's part of the goal of this campaign. As I'm running here in this seat, I'm trying to recruit people around the country, which is something I've done in the past. And I'm trying to build sort of a movement that'll get into office, going in 2028 with, a new platform, completely change the brand of the Democratic Party. That's the goal here.
What you're sort of hitting on there is, I guess, a kind of central tension that I'm seeing in a lot of Democratic politicians and operatives at the moment is this sort of tension between being like defenders of institutions and democracy and like having valid critiques of those institutions, which seem to speak to the concerns of voters. So like, how do you approach that challenge of, on the one hand, if you're on the left of politics, you want to see, a strong state, a strong government, strong, democratic institutions that are able to affect people's lives and affect that change. So you on the one hand, you need to sort of be an institution person, but on the other hand, there's all of this anger in the electorate about the way that those institutions have been running. How do you approach people who are pissed off that tell them what they're pissed off at, the government, is part of the answer?
I think you don't defend institutions for the sake of the institutions, right? You have to talk about how to solve people's real problems. And, I'm going to step back into history because we have been through this before. If you go back to the 1930s, it's not the exact same sort of far-right movement, but we had a really strong far-right movement in America back then. It was, we actually had these big Nazi rallies in Madison Square Garden that were like filling the stadium there. And the way we defeated that far-right movement was FDR came in and he put the country on a mission, both through the New Deal and through the mobilization for World War II. And the mission wasn't, let's build up institutions. The mission was, I'm going to get you out of poverty and we're going to build up an industrial economy that will, win the war against the Nazis, but also create the industrial base that was the source of wealth for the middle class for the next several decades. And that proved that the institutions work. It proved that democracy works. And so it laid to rest this idea that you need an authoritarian to come in and, solve everything by themselves, because that's the argument that works when institutions start failing. So I think we actually have to set the country on a mission and actually set the goals for the mission, right? Like, what are we going to do? And then the institutions are the byproduct of that. And right now the pitch is going to be, Trump is going to get 4 years to not fix these underlying problems. So people, I think, are going to be open to, all right, what's next? And they're not going to care about, like, do we create this agency or that agency? Do we fund like what we had before? We actually have to solve the problem. And through that mission, we build up, rebuild the institutions that he's gutting right now and do it correctly this time, right? Do it better.
Yeah, interesting. So you're running against Nancy Pelosi. She is the former Speaker of the House, a very well-respected and entrenched member of the Democratic establishment. She has a significant power base. She's a big person to run against. Why have you chosen this fight, and why do you think that replacing Pelosi with a younger, more progressive candidate like yourself is, a net positive in the Democratic Party at the moment?
Yeah, well, I live in San Francisco, so she's my representative. So I haven't chosen to fight so much as this is where I run. But I will say, I worked in Congress for about a year, and in that time, I really saw how Nancy Pelosi operates, and I've got a lot of respect for a lot of what she's done. But she really comes from this era of politics that I think is dead right now. In her era of politics, she got elected in 1987 when I was 1 year old. I'm 39 now, but she remembers this Republican Party that was still kind of sane. It was a Republican Party that believed in democracy, even believed in climate change. She and Newt Gingrich did this ad in 2005 about how they're going to tackle climate change together. And I really think she still kind of believes that party exists somewhere. As soon as Donald Trump's out of the picture, all these Republicans are going to come back to the table and she'll be able to do her bipartisan deal making again. But I kind of think that's misjudging the challenge that's ahead of us, right? Like, I think we're at this point where the old status quo is falling and there's a battle for ideas. The right recognizes this. So they're coming in with their story for why you can't afford a house, why you can't get a good job. And their story is America spent too much time focusing on immigrants and other people in other countries and not enough time on you, where you could be whatever small group of people that the right wants to include, right? And I think the job in front of the Democrats is to pitch the expansive new vision for how to create a multicultural democracy and how to solve these problems our way. Which systems do we actually have to completely change? Those ideas are not going to come from someone who is part of that old institution like Nancy Pelosi. And it's not about being more progressive or more moderate. I'm talking about just solving problems. There's so many issues where the American public actually agree overwhelmingly. If you talk about universal health care, universal child care, talk about ending this genocide in Gaza, the American public actually agree in a bipartisan fashion. Ending corruption in politics, right? Like banning members of Congress from trading stocks, banning the revolving door between Congress and the lobbying industry, ending big money in politics. All these issues poll overwhelmingly well. So I'm actually running on, I'd say, the platform that is the current popular in some ways, moderate platform, because that's what the moderate American believes. And so, but whereas Nancy Pelosi, I think, is kind of stopping these ideas from actually taking root. We saw this with the Green New Deal. When we launched the Green New Deal, her reaction to it was to try to stop it, not try to use that energy to turn it into something. And I think that's the wrong way to do politics today.
You say that, this is just your seat, it's where you live, so this is the fight you have. But you have worked in the past with organizations like Justice Democrats, for instance, to recruit people to run around the country. And you worked with AOC, who's from New York, for instance. So like primarying more moderate Democrats does seem to be a strategy that you've invested a lot of time in and a lot of resources in, right? And so why focus on that as opposed to, say, spending all of your time trying to flip purple or swing seats, in districts, elsewhere in the country? Why primary Democrats?
I think it's got to be both, and this is what I'm saying is I think that we have a Democratic Party right now that is our opposition party. That's the vessel through which to challenge Republicans in other seats as well. And I think it's a party right now that's completely bought out by corporate interests and big moneyed interests. And so that prevents it from actually championing these issues that most people want to see championed. And I think in order to win those other seats, we actually need a party that's going to fight and a party that's going to be willing to present ideas on how to fight, right? So I think it's both, right? When I ran Justice Democrats, the original goal of that wasn't to primary moderate Democrats. It was to actually recruit people all across the country. It was called Brand New Congress, and we did recruit people in both red districts and purple districts and blue districts, right? I think that's the goal today, right? I think the establishment Democrats actually have a sort of losing political strategy where they only focus on recruiting in purple districts. But the reality is the number of purple districts is shrinking because of demographic shifts. California is losing population. Texas is gaining population, right? By 2032, if all we do is win these swing seats, right, the swing states in the presidential races, the Democratic Party's gone. We're not going to be able to win any races. So I actually think we need a strong break from what the party has been to create this new party that can actually compete in every state, in every district. And we need to be recruiting people everywhere. And I think that's going to happen from some sort of exciting vision of like, what is the change that'll fix this underlying problem, right? The underlying problems that people are facing, rather than just continue to pitch us as like the anti-Trump party. I think that's not going to be enough.
The sort of message that you would be running on, the sort of, progressive sentiments, do you think that they can win across people outside of, the sort of liberal capitals? Do you think that the sort of messages that you're running on are, applicable to people who might be right-leaning, people who might be more centrist, that kind of thing? Or do you, think that you can run those messages in, say, New York, San Francisco, etc., and you've got to sort of vary your messages across the country? Or do you think there's a sort of more unified message that the Democratic Party could take, which would be popular everywhere?
I think there's a more unified message. I really think the left versus right dichotomy is the wrong lens to be looking at politics today. I think the real lens for politics today is people who have been cut out from the system, who think we have a rigged political and economic system that they can no longer participate in, that's keeping them from being able to afford a house or raise a family, that's keeping them from having a real voice in Congress, where they're seeing powerful people get away with whatever, whereas, those laws don't apply to them. And it's them versus this other segment of society that gets away with everything. The elites that have, the elites and big money interests that have a lock on our politics. I think that's the actual divide. And that works in every district. And, it's just funny because when I look at some of the stuff Trump's doing, Trump just took a 10% stake in Intel in exchange for money, right? An equity stake. This was a far left idea that we've been pitching at New Consensus for the past 5 years. And yet we see our far right president doing it, right? I don't think most people see actions like that and think of it in those terms. They're like, is this a left idea or a right idea? They're just looking at it as like, does this make sense? Government's giving money. Should we make money back from it? Sure. Right. And I think that's the way you pitch it. Like a lot of the work I've been doing has been about how do we reindustrialize the Midwest? Honestly, this is stuff I can't run on in San Francisco because we don't really have, a bunch of manufacturing jobs in San Francisco. But at New Consensus, which is the think tank I run, a lot of our work has been about how do we rebuild manufacturing? How do you rebuild high wealth, high wage jobs that you can get to with just a high school degree? And the actual actions for doing all that. How do we do all that in the past? And so, yeah, I think we run on the popular ideas. That's what I'm trying to picture, and a lot of what I'm talking about, what I'm running on in San Francisco, is popular economic ideas.
Yeah, interesting. I'm interested to sort of leave that aside and talk a little bit about your background. So you started out working in tech before you were in politics. I guess the sort of popular narrative about tech at the moment is look how many of these tech leaders are all going MAGA and jumping across to the sort of alt right of politics. But I guess have you taken anything from your time working in tech that might be applicable from say San Francisco to Washington?
Yeah, my time in tech was interesting because I joined the tech industry back in 2009, 2000, and that was actually what brought me to San Francisco originally. And um, I have I enjoyed what I did there. It was like really fun to work on the stuff in tech, but a lot of what I saw in tech was sort of what drove me into progressive politics. Because at the time, tech was really being pitched as the way to solve the big problems in the world, and it just clearly wasn't. And I ended up working on Bernie's campaign as a director of organizing technology. So I used my tech skills, but I wanted to bring them towards problems where I felt like tech was really not solving anything. In fact, it was making it sort of worse in a lot of ways. I really developed this view of the world where I saw how inequality itself was so devastating, right? And I just think it's sort of unfair. Like the entire way the tech world works, the tech industry works, is kind of this lottery system. Like you go in and you can win the startup lottery and you can make a ton of money. And sure, people work hard, but that's a crazy way to organize an economy. Like, why is it that like a few tech people can make so much money, but at the same time, other people who are doing just as valuable work, who are working really hard, can't make that much money or can't, afford even like a home or a secure retirement? That to me is completely crazy. And I think that fundamentally, to some extent, is like why our country is headed the way it is. Everyone's just like gambling on things like winning the startup lottery, winning a crypto lottery, right? Rather than us trying to invest in an actual sustainable economy where people can just work hard and make a decent living that affords the basics. One thing when I worked in tech, I didn't meet most of the people that are now part of the MAGA right, but I did meet Peter Thiel once. And he came to give a talk and told us about how diversity is the source of our weakness in our startup. You should always be hiring against diversity. And that was, he was like this sort of fringe political person at the time. He had his like ideological anarcho-capitalist bullshit that he was working on. And I never thought that would really come to anywhere near real power. So seeing people like Peter Thiel representing tech in some ways, I absolutely hate it. Like, and everyone in San Francisco is embarrassed by it. Like people who work in the tech industry, they hate it the most because they do not want to be represented by Peter Thiel or Elon Musk or any of these guys who are just being, opportunists in the worst way with this MAGA movement. And so I guess I've been motivated against them. Like I want to show what good tech people could be doing, not just have tech be represented by, honestly, kind of evil ideologies.
Yeah, interesting. So you spoke there about winning the startup lottery. I guess you kind of did win the startup lottery in a way. You worked at a very successful company, Stripe, and you made a lot of money out of that. And so you're running against Pelosi, who is one of the wealthiest members of Congress. A lot of people follow her stock picks to know what to invest in. Whoever continues on in that seat is probably going to be one of the wealthier people in Congress. But you do have this kind of interesting phenomenon at the moment, I suppose, where you've got someone like, say, J.B. Pritzker, who's also very wealthy guy, but he's one of the more progressive governors in the country, if not the most progressive. And you could go all the way back, as you often do, to say FDR as an example of someone who was quite well off, but also was the most progressive president that the US has had.
Yeah, I mean, sort of how I was mentioning, right? The work I did in tech, I worked hard, right? Like, and I'm proud of some of the work I did, but I didn't work harder than a teacher or a nurse or a sanitation worker or any of the number of people who do extremely valuable work in our society. And my whole experience with that, it really gave me a lens into how inequality shapes our society. Because it's completely crazy that I worked hard for 2 years, and now if I wanted to, I could never work another day in my life. where the other people who are working hard every day will never be able to afford a home. Why does that make sense? How does that make sense, right? And I think that the fact that we've just like accepted that as a way our society has to go is completely nuts. And I think we're just sleepwalking into dystopia. I really do. And I think we've got to tackle our inequality head on. I call for a wealth tax on the ultra rich, including myself, right? And I would like to see people like JB Pritzker also calling for that. But I also call for things like Medicare for all, for universal childcare. I think we've got to actually focus on making society livable for the vast majority of people. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think because I had some experience with this and saw just how weird and twisted it is. I didn't grow up rich. I grew up, middle class in Texas, went to public schools. And so going from that experience to the experience I had in tech, it was just weird and crazy. And it makes no sense to me to organize our society like that. Because, yeah, people should get rewarded for starting companies, but they shouldn't get all the money. That doesn't make any sense to me.
This interview was from an episode of the Prospect podcast. To listen to the episode in full, including further discussion and our weekly banger and dud section, click the link in the description below. And to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, head to prospectmagazine.co.uk.